All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our second issue briefing, where we get you up to speed on all the issues that the association is following, our positions, and the impact that we're having here in DC and the States. I just want to quickly remind everyone to given our ongoing conversations the past couple months, to definitely contact me as soon as possible if you're planning on scheduling a meeting with your legislator next month during the August recess, when pretty much all of Congress is back home in the district of the state. I've heard from a couple of you asking about this process of inviting a legislator to your facility, but those sorts of events don't really kind of happen overnight. They take a few weeks planning, usually at least. So definitely give me a call or email me sometime in the next week or so if that's something that you're interested in doing or kind of is on your agenda for the next month or so. Also, if your company already has something planned, or you find out that one of your colleagues is involved in some sort of political event next month, there's tons of stuff going on. Just shoot me a quick email letting me know. We just kind of like to know who our members are meeting with, so we can kind of get a better sense of kind of how expansive our industry political network is, and be there to assist you in getting the most out of these face-to-face interactions with your legislators. Also, I believe I briefly mentioned this on our last call, but our department is looking at doing some sort of government affairs briefing on the Monday afternoon, I think during the Apex show this fall. I believe it's November 2nd, I think, that Monday. So before any of the exhibits or booths open, we'll be sending out invites, I think, to many people, the board, some of our PAC contributors. Obviously, as we hope that, as advocacy leaders, you will be able to stop by as well. So maybe, block off a couple hours if you'll be at the show that afternoon leading up to the chairman's dinner that night, and I will let everyone know of the details, of more details as they come in closer to the date. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our guests today, my colleagues Paul and Andres, who will discuss some of the major issues they're following. Just a quick intro for each of them. Paul Fiore is Director of Government Affairs, and he spent years as an owner-operator of a neighborhood service dealer here in Maryland, and then went on to work for the Tire Industry Association before coming here in 2011. Paul is on Capitol Hill a good amount, attending fundraisers and meeting with legislative staff. His main issues are small business, tax reform, healthcare, and labor, all of which he'll be going into detail today. And then you'll hear from Andres Castrillon, who is our Senior Counsel for International Affairs. Andres is a trade lawyer who works with our members not only on importing parts, but on also opening up other markets for export opportunities. Of course, he's the liaison to our international segment, AIA, and he's actually just started up a new committee called the International Trade Committee, which will be hosting its first meeting at Fall Leadership Days this September in Austin. And also, as always, if you have any questions during the presentation, please write them in the chat box or the question box on the right, and we will get to them at the end. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Paul, and you can go get started.
Oh, thank you, David. Can you hear me all right before I get going?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, good. I want to thank the participants myself. I'm appreciative of your time today. So I want to start with a 30,000-foot view on healthcare, talk about a couple of things, and then drill down on a couple of smaller issues. Let's see. There we go. So Obamacare is the talk of the nation. We're all very tired of the conversation around it. At the same time, many of us are still actively working to change some of the effects of Obamacare. It was passed in March of 2010. I have to say that for our own experience, small business was left off the table when this formulation was taking place. We knocked on the door many times over the years, and we were not invited to take part. So one of the things that's happened over the years since 2010 is that the House has passed legislation to repeal Obamacare 50-some times. Now, conversely, before the Obamacare, the House also passed what we used to call association healthcare legislation, and that went nowhere. So it's just been a very frustrating thing all the way around. What you see on the screen, reconciliation is kind of the current conversation on the Hill with respect to repealing Obamacare, and I will say that that's a very convoluted, difficult process. There probably aren't 20 people on the Hill who actually understand reconciliation, but nonetheless, it's in the conversation. Lastly, King versus Burwell was the Supreme Court case, and give me 1 second. The expected outcome for many people was that they were not going to allow the subsidies at the state level, which would completely alter how Obamacare or healthcare took place in the state-run exchanges. So we were all surprised by the fact that once again the Supreme Court upheld the principles of Obamacare. Now, that kind of led many of us to believe on the Hill that this would open up kind of a floodgate of Obamacare fixes. Sorry, it's not cooperating here.
Going forward.
Yeah, I've lost the control, Dave. Can you get it back?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. So there are probably at least 12 bills on the Hill right now that are what we call fixes, and they include the 30-hour mandate going back to 40 hours, the repeal of the employer mandate, but none of those things are really gaining any traction. So there's a conversation right now among a broad coalition of folks that are involved in healthcare efforts to try and focus on a few things that might actually work. One of the issues that we have is that we don't know if even the Republican leadership is interested in passing some fixes currently, or whether they want to continue to use Obamacare as anti-Democrat messaging, which is a very real possibility. As most of you know from the media, it looks like the 2016 presidential contest is, for all intents and purposes, already started. So with all that being said, I want to focus on just two specific pieces of legislation that the Healthcare Association is actively involved in, and what could have some very real effect on some of the smaller businesses. So the health insurance tax was basically created at the 11th hour of the formulation of Obamacare. It was done on the Senate side, and they had a gaping hole in the funding for what this would cost the budget. So sitting around the table, people thought, well, everyone really dislikes the insurance carriers. Let's tax them. But so they came up with a formula based on market share that insurance companies would pay a certain amount of tax on premiums that they charge. So it became pretty obvious, even to the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation, that the insurance companies would pass through this right onto the premiums. So it was an immediate hit. Now, this tax is only on the fully insured market, which is basically 90% of small businesses. So if you have self-insured plans, which most larger businesses do, you're not even affected by this. We anticipate premium increases of about $350 to $500 annually per family. Now, if you think about it, if you've got 50 employees and a family plan in your business, that's a substantial hit. We don't know how that's going to play out with respect to a lot of our businesses. One of the things that we're hoping is that we can get this thing either repealed or delayed. There is a bill out there now. It's on the House and the Senate side. We have 233 co-sponsors, some of them Democrats. Not a lot, but there are some on there. So the chances are, well, let's put it at slim, but we're still actively working on it. Moving on to the next bill is small group expansion. Now, this one's a little tricky, but in the small groups are typically up to 50 employees, and it's a totally separate market. So most national insurers are in almost all states for large group market coverage. They're only in some small group markets. But once groups are sized 51 to 100 become small groups, the insurers would need to enter the entire small group market in order to continue to sell coverage to this segment. So what Obamacare is saying is that in January of 2016, everyone that is currently 50 to 100 employees is going to become small group. The reality is that most of these groups that are sized 51 to 100 are going to end up with fewer insurance carrier options once they are redefined into the market. We believe that some employers could easily see premium impacts of 35% or more. The majority will probably average somewhere between 18 and 20%. There is legislation to give this back to the states, the control of the small group market, which is where it has traditionally been. They've had the option to increase it. None of the 50 states have done so yet. I can give you information later if you are interested about the bills. I hope you are. That particular bill already has 197 co-sponsors. That's about all I want to say right now on health insurance. Let me talk a little bit about some of the tax issues that we're following here. The current priorities are, first of all, comprehensive tax reform. You've probably heard this if you watch any news channels or anything. It's been, the conversation waxes and wanes on this. The biggest question is, will it ever happen? What I mean by that is whether the sides can come to terms on whether this can be done. Of course, the Democrats want it to be revenue enhancing if we do total tax reform, and the Republicans want it to be revenue neutral. Maybe some of you have actually heard that the possible funding of a long-term highway bill would be ironed out in corporate tax reform or comprehensive tax reform. No one knows how this is going to go. I would be comfortable telling you that the gridlock that we have indicates that it's fairly insurmountable. Given that, one of the concerns that we have, if they get to it, is something that we like to talk about called a fair and effective tax rate. The administration and I think a couple of committees on the Hill, some of the Senate committees in particular, feel like they could do a tax reform with C corporations only, meaning large businesses would get the break, and that S corps, pass-throughs, LLCs, partnerships, basically your small businesses would not see a tax reform. Well, we obviously aren't going to stand for that, and we are participating in coalitions that are fighting against that. This is all about, when I say that we're actively fighting these things on the Hill, we are either knocking on doors ourselves, the Auto Care Association, or we are participating in coalitions and engaging with messaging ourselves to members of Congress through letters, resolutions, and the constant pressure. So another tax issue that's really big for us is LIFO. I'm not sure who's represented in the audience here, but there's a good chance that your company uses what's called the last in, first out inventory accounting method. This creates something that's called a LIFO reserve, and the problem is that most legislators don't really understand what this is. It's been historically targeted in tax reform. It's basically considered a tax loophole by many on the left, and it has a large score, something to the tune of about 60 to 80 billion dollars over 10 years if they repealed this inventory accounting method. Now, we've done some research with our members, and one of the things became obvious very quickly is that they would be financially burdened to the point of possibly having to restructure their businesses. Some of the reserves we looked at were in the range of $250,000 to $2 million. As you can well imagine, having that kind of exposure is pretty frightening for a business. One last point on this issue is that in that same member survey, we discovered that no amount of comprehensive tax reform, in other words, the lowering of the rate from, say, 35% to 28%, would actually make up for what they lost if they lost the ability to use this inventory accounting method. So we're going to stay strong on this issue. There's a very large coalition. Many industries that are involved in warehousing are obviously affected by this. I think I'm going to leave the tax issues there. Let's see. Oh, this is always fun. The labor issues seem to be kind of perennial, and they are actually on the increase now because of what is considered a very active National Labor Relations Board. This is another government agency that's fairly independent and is run by commissioners that are traditionally either Democrat or Republican, and depending on the majority, based on basically the administration that's in power. The current NLRB has been accused of being a tool of the administration and the unions, which from all activities would seem to be true. A few of the issues that we are watching here, I hope some of you are familiar with them. We certainly talk about them a lot. We've published articles. And they've also gotten quite a bit of coverage in the media. Card check is the first one, and this is a bill that surfaces annually or biannually with respect to allowing unions to form in a business simply by having a certain number of employees just fill off a card, sign a card, and collect the cards and turn them in. That would do away with the loss of the private ballot, or secret ballot, if you will. Fortunately, that legislation has never passed Congress, and it did come close in the Clinton years. It was brought back in the first Obama administration. A strong effort by businesses across the country prevented that from passage in the Senate. One of the things that, another issue is ambush elections. What typically takes place if a company does have an effort to unionize, there is a process in place where communication between the employer and the employees takes place. They are given probably about 50 days total. Research shows that most elections take place within 38 days. The NLRB passed a regulation, and it is in effect now, that the election can take place within about 10 days. This is pretty problematic. There are current lawsuits, and one court case was just decided against the efforts of businesses today and went for the NLRB. That case will continue to go through the appellate courts. Another issue that's very troublesome for businesses is the ability to form micro unions. This first took place in a nursing home. I don't know the number of employees, but what happened was a small group of nurses either on a floor or in a subsection of the nursing home were allowed to unionize. We were all taken aback by the approval of this. There have been lawsuits that are also have failed. Some recent developments have been in department stores where I believe it was a New York City department store where the shoe department was actually able to unionize without the rest of the store. As you can imagine, that's fairly troubling for any kind of business. I think it's not hard to picture a warehouse distributor or a jobber where just the counter employees decide to unionize. It could be a real problem. We are continuing to fight these in the courts. We are doing that as members of something called the Coalition for a Democratic Workplace. Again, I have a lot more information on these. If people want access to that, I'm happy to provide it. So the last issue I want to talk about with the department, labor issues, something recently came out of the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division. This has been big news, and you might have heard about this too. The 40-hour work week overtime rule has been standard for decades now. And the Obama administration had hinted earlier that they were thinking of changing it, and they did. They just recently announced that the rulemaking is considering changing it from $23,600 to $50,440. Now, what that means is that you were exempt from the overtime in any work, in any job, if you had what was considered a salaried or white-collar job. And if you made over $23,600, that's the basis for that. Now, from this point forward, if this rule goes through, that jumps all the way, of course it's over a 100% increase, to $50,000, so that anyone who makes less than $50,000 is going to be subject to the overtime regulation. There's so much wrong with this that we are having a hard time understanding what the administration thinks they're trying to do. We think that about 4 million employees across the country are going to be affected by this. And then the side effects in a small business or even some of the larger businesses are going to be just basically impossible to imagine. You've got a tremendous workforce that's going to lose a lot of autonomous privileges, loss of incentive pay. We really don't know what the administration's thinking. The rulemaking also suggested that they would be revisiting the duties test. Now, what that refers to is the job description itself. Is it sufficient enough to be considered a white-collar job? This was weekly talked about in the rulemaking, and historically, without any detail, we think we've actually got some grounds for a good lawsuit there just based on that alone. But the association will be submitting comments. The first thing we're going to try and do is get the comment period extended. The comments are due on this rulemaking by September 4th. The first thing we're going to ask for is an extension, and we are also encouraging individual businesses to submit their own comments, and we are happy to direct you in that process. So with that, I really would encourage you to contact us if any of these issues pique your interest. Please type in any questions that these may have brought up, and thank you for your time. I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you, Paul. Good stuff. Like you said, you know, if you missed anything, I know it's a lot to cover in a short amount of time, but if you missed anything or you have any follow-up questions, definitely write them in the box on the right. It's no question is dumb. Let me turn it over to Andres right now. 1 second. All right, Andres, go ahead.
All right, thanks, David, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me introduce myself again quickly for anybody that wasn't on the call in the beginning. My name is Andres Castrillo, and I'm the Senior Counsel for International Trade, and I oversee all policy, international trade policy and regulatory issues here for the association. So we're going to cover international trade policy today. And what I want to do is first start with an overview rather than jump into specific issues. And then I want to focus on one issue to sort of highlight the way that international trade works and how it may impact you in your day-to-day business. The topic that I've chosen to talk about today is free trade agreements. And I've done that for two primary reasons. The first one is that free trade agreements are relevant to everybody. There's nobody on this call and there's nobody in this industry that is not impacted one way or another by the free trade agreement negotiation process and the outcome of those negotiations. And then the second reason is that it's a very hot button topic right now. If you've been following the papers, you probably read a lot about something called TPA, or Trade Promotion Authority, over the last several months. And then within those articles, they always talk about two ongoing free trade agreement negotiations, one called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, and another one called the TTIP, which is the U.S.-EU Free Trade Agreement. So we'll get into all of that. Oh, sorry, 1 second here. Yeah, I got it. Okay, so what are we talking about when we talk about international trade policy? International trade is sort of a broad term. It gets thrown around a lot. And when we're talking about international trade policy, I list here some of the key components that you should be aware of, or that you should be thinking of from your company perspective when we talk about international trade policy. So the first is trade negotiations. These are free trade agreements. These are negotiations where the U.S. government is out negotiating for an outcome with either one other country on a bilateral basis or several other countries on a multilateral basis. And we'll talk about some of the different forums and places that this takes place in a second. International trade disputes. Sometimes you hear about countries arguing over things like subsidies or currency manipulation. You hear a lot about the World Trade Organization, the way that businesses or individuals can sue themselves and allege a violation of some law. The United States is party to several international treaties on international trade that allow the U.S. government to allege an international trade violation or to be subject to some sort of a case as well. And a lot of those are industry specific, and there's been cases on autos and auto parts. The most high-profile ones have been involving Japan and China. So there are opportunities for countries to sue each other to address various trade issues. Customs and border policy. Obviously, when we talk about international trade, we're talking about the movement of goods and services across borders. So the policies that regulate what can come in and what can come out. And not just domestically. We're not talking just about U.S. regulations. If you work for a company that exports, you're concerned about what the U.S. restrictions are on products leaving the U.S., but you're also concerned on what the import restrictions are in the foreign markets that you're targeting. So customs and border policy, domestically and internationally. In this industry, in particular, intellectual property is a big issue. So once you get something into another country, what happens to your intellectual property there? If you're sourcing products from abroad, what are the IPR protections in that country so that your manufacturing and all of your trade secrets are protected? And then market access. What markets do you have access to? Can you not get a certain product into a particular market for some reason? What are those reasons, and are they in violation of any international treaties that we're a part of? So those are some of the main areas that we focus on when we're talking about international trade policy. Just want to give you a quick overview of who the players are in the international trade policy landscape. The first is the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, and I'm going to talk about them in more detail on the next slide. Obviously, anytime we're talking about policy, we're talking about Congress, and I'll also talk about them in a little bit more detail in a second, specifically the committees that have oversight or jurisdiction over international trade policy. part of the USTR is something called the Trade Policy Staff Committee, which you don't necessarily need to know about, but it helps drive an important point. It helps illustrate an important point, and that's that when we talk about international trade and international trade deals and agreements, they tend these days not to be just about trade. So if we're going to sign an international trade treaty with another country, it can't just be about trade, right? It involves a lot of other areas of our government. And so the International Trade Policy Staff Committee is a group of various agencies that come in to give input and help negotiate free trade agreements. These are people like or agencies like the Department of Commerce, the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Labor, State, Treasury. So that helps illustrate how complicated international trade can be and how multifaceted it can be. And then lastly here, a key component of international trade is industry groups. When the U.S. government goes out to address an international trade issue or negotiate a new agreement, what is their primary objective? Well, getting an agreement that's going to benefit the most U.S. industries possible. And for them to do that, they need input from a lot of different people in the industry. What problems are you having gaining access to a market? What regulatory restrictions exist, and so on and so forth. So the key point here is that industry groups play a very important role in international trade policy making. And it's important for us as an industry to have a seat at the table and to have an open dialogue about these various international trade issues so that as an association and as an industry, we can communicate to our U.S. government representatives what we want to see addressed as part of international trade negotiations. I mentioned the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative in the last slide, and I just want to quickly talk a little bit more about them because they're really at the front lines of international trade policy making at the global level. This is an agency under the executive branch, so under the President, that develops and coordinates the President's international trade policy agenda. So when we're talking about the U.S. negotiators, this is the agency that we're talking about. When we talk about trade disputes and bilateral dispute resolution, these are the guys that have a legal team in place, international trade lawyers, who argue these cases at the World Trade Organization, for example. I mentioned that there's an interagency structure, so a lot of different agencies participate in the policy-making process with USTR. And then the other thing to note about them is they're organized by regional and by functional offices. So there's country desks and there's regional desks, and then there's more functional offices. So WTO negotiations, there's one for goods, there's one for services, things of that nature. So very similar to the way that the Department of Commerce is organized. And then I also mentioned Congress, and I just want to highlight on the next two slides who the committees are on the House and the Senate who have jurisdiction over international trade, so that you can take a look at who the representatives are that sit on these committees and take a look and see if these are any of your representatives. So on the House side, it's the House Ways and Means Committee. That committee has a trade subcommittee, and you can see who the folks are on the overall committee here. Now, just a quick point that I want to make is that these aren't the only people who are following international trade or who care about international trade, but these are the people who sort of focus on it on a day-to-day basis. Trade legislation will come out of this committee, and they sort of set the agenda. If you don't see your congressperson on here, it doesn't mean that they don't care about international trade, or you shouldn't raise an international trade issue in a meeting with them. I just want to highlight who the committees are. On the Senate side, it's the Senate Finance Committee, which also has a trade subcommittee, and you can see who the folks are here. All right, real quick on I mentioned that there were various venues, and I just wanted to give you an overview of some of the different international bodies and venues that come into play in international trade policy. International trade is often multilateral, meaning that it's not just two countries. There are negotiations that take place amongst a group of countries. One of the most well-known bodies is the World Trade Organization. or the WTO. We are members. Most of the developed nations in the world are members, as are a lot of the developing nations. I think at last count there's 154 total members of the WTO. The WTO is basically a series of treaties that cover all sorts of different trade issues. And when we talk about international trade disputes, this is the body that we're often talking about. I don't want to spend too much time on the others. I just wanted to list a few examples. So the OECD, the G8 and the G20 you read about in the paper all the time. So those are the group of the most industrialized nations in the world. Beyond the big multilateral bodies, there's also a lot of regional bodies. So we're all familiar with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. CAFTA is another free trade agreement that you hear about a lot. That's the Central American Free Trade Agreement. The TPP we'll talk about, APEC in the Asia Pacific region. So that's the regional area. And then there's a lot of bilateral negotiations and issues that go on. So those are free trade agreements that are just between two countries, and I'll talk about those in a second. Bilateral investment treaties that are sort of free trade agreements that only deal with investment issues. So these put in place protections for you when you invest in another country so that you don't get caught up in their court system, so that there's a dispute settlement procedure in place when you invest as a company in another country. And then various trade policy forums. With some of our more important trading partners that we don't have a free trade agreement with, or we don't have a bilateral investment treaty with, what the U.S. government does is they organize these annual or biannual forums. So we have these with countries like China or Brazil, where twice a year the negotiators from those countries will get together and they'll have an agenda of all of the pending trade and investment issues that are going on between the countries, and they'll negotiate and try to resolve these things. And oftentimes, as part of those forums, there's an opportunity for, again, industry groups to come in and educate the negotiators on what outcomes they want to see come out of those forums. So the Auto Care Association has participated, it has submitted comments and suggestions on the forum with China, and will probably continue to do so with other countries as well. So moving on to specific issues in the current trade agenda and some of the key components of President Obama's trade agenda. And I list 3 of them here, and they all have to do with free trade agreements. The first is Trade Promotion Authority, which is a mechanism to pass free trade agreements, which I'll talk about in a second. And then the other 2, the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TPP and TTIP, those are the actual 2 current free trade agreements that are being negotiated and that are pending. Very hot topic issues in the newspapers right now, and very big issues for the automotive industry as a whole. So if you've been following the news, you may have read that recently something called Trade Promotion Authority was passed. And I just have the vote records here, not as important. But I want to talk about the mechanism of TPA and why it's important. TPA is a mechanism that allows the President and USTR to go out and negotiate a free trade agreement with negotiating objectives that have been provided by Congress, and then bring that bill back to Congress for approval in an up or down vote. Okay, so international treaties have to be, they're negotiated by the executive branch, but they have to be passed into law by the Congress. So as you can imagine, if the President goes out and negotiates an agreement, comes back and presents it to the Congress, and they go through their normal process where they add other things and attach other things and amend language, then when we go back to sign the agreement, it's not the agreement that the President signed, which would obviously frustrate our international partners and be a very inefficient system. So what Trade Promotion Authority does is it's a mechanism that allows the President to go out, negotiate the deal with guidance that has been provided ahead of time by the Congress, and then come back with that treaty and present it for an up or down vote. So much more streamlined process. And what you need to know about this is the only way that free trade agreements get done. Okay, so all of the ones that have been passed recently, be it NAFTA, CAFTA, Colombia, Panama, Korea, which are all fairly recent FTAs. None of those were done without TPA. So without TPA, we're sort of powerless to get a free trade agreement in place. So we have that now. It lapsed in 2007, and there was all sorts of negotiating and haggling back and forth in the House and Senate, but we have TPA now. So now all the focus has shifted to the actual FTAs that are being negotiated. And I just want to talk quickly about the FTAs that we have in place and why these are important. We currently have 14 free trade agreements with 20 different countries. And I'll just give you one stat that illustrates the importance of free trade agreements that's specific to our industry. 80% of U.S. auto parts exports go to free trade agreement countries. So 80% of exports in our industry go to these 20 countries that you see on the page here. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that there are a lot of benefits to free trade agreements. The first thing that you get with the free trade agreement is a reduction of tariffs. So typically when you import something, there's an import tariff associated with that. What FTAs do is they either eliminate the tariffs right away or they phase them out over time. Okay, so what was before a 5 or 8 or 10% duty is now 0. So anybody that we have a free trade agreement with, if you're exporting to that country, that's a competitive advantage right there, right off the bat, versus one of your other competitors from a different country. Okay? So that's the tariff barriers. But even more important than those are the non-tariff barriers, the regulations, the different restrictions that you have to abide by in order to get a product into that country. Through FTAs, they also address these non-tariff barriers. Strengthening protections for investments in property. If you are investing or exporting or doing business in an FTA country and you get into trouble, there's certain protections that are in place and certain dispute settlement mechanisms that allow you to take your case to a binational panel. So for example, in a NAFTA country, there's something called a NAFTA binational panel. So rather than have to go to Mexican court, which you're not familiar with, which has a different legal system than the U.S., which you could be locked into for 8 or 10 or more years, you can take that to a binational panel and have your issue addressed, much more similar to the legal system that we're familiar and comfortable with. And then they also address different customs procedures. So the basic point is that it's much easier and much safer to do business in a free trade agreement country. So obviously the more FTAs, free trade agreements that we have in place, the better. I often get phone calls from members who are considering entering a new market or trying to prioritize what markets they want to enter into. And I always tell them that it's best and safest to focus on the FTA countries and that there are a lot of different hurdles to entering non-FTA countries. So quickly on the two free trade agreements that are pending. The first is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and you can see here that this is an FTA with a bunch of countries on either side of the Pacific, okay? And you can see them all listed here in the second bullet. These countries account for a huge portion of global trade, and this deal seeks to do what all of the other deals do, eliminate the tariffs, address some of those non-tariff barriers, and open up markets, very key markets for our exporters, and lower some of the barriers to importing for some of our importers and a lot of our manufacturers who are importing or sourcing from all over the world. This deal, you'll notice one key thing is that it doesn't include China, and that's by design. The idea behind this deal is it's to sort of counterbalance some of the advances that China has made in the Asia-Pacific region, so that through this deal with all of these countries and markets, we will be in a better position competitively versus Chinese competitors. The other important thing about this deal that you'll notice is that it includes both Canada and Mexico. And Canada and Mexico are obviously our NAFTA partners. So if and when this deal passes and gets approved, this deal essentially replaces NAFTA and makes it a much larger multilateral free trade agreement. And then the other one is the U.S.-EU Free Trade Agreement, and that one's in much earlier stages than the TPP. This one started negotiations last year. These things tend to drag on for a few years. The TPP has been in negotiations for upwards of 4 years now. But in this industry especially, people know how important EU-U.S. trade is and how much trade moves back and forth. Indeed, a lot of our members are European-owned companies. So again, looking to eliminate the barriers, but what's most important in this deal is seeking to figure out a solution to the different regulations that exist in the EU and in the U.S. So if you can imagine a European company manufacturing a product in the U.S. that wouldn't be allowed to enter the EU. So because of slightly different regulatory restrictions. So even slightly different rules, if you've got to tweak your manufacturing process at all, that can be very expensive. And it makes no sense that a European company manufacturing in the U.S. couldn't manufacture that product for both the U.S. and EU markets. So when we talk about what's important for the TTIP, it's really that regulatory cooperation. And the different options that are listed here is, do we harmonize the rules so that the EU and the U.S. have the same rules through different reforms? Is it better to have a mutual recognition system in place where anything that is accepted into the U.S. and abides by U.S. rules will automatically be allowed into the EU? These are the difficult issues that the negotiators have to address. And they can only do so effectively, again, if industry is coming in and educating them on what the problems are. So those are the two free trade agreements, and you're probably wondering what our position is on them. And I'll be quick on this. We support both of them. We support the lowering of trade restrictions and the opening of new markets. Our industry is a global industry. A lot of our members are looking international for their growth. They're relying on international growth to continue to be successful. So we've got to put ourselves in a position to be competitive in these markets. Our big international competitors, China, India, Mexico, they're all going out there and signing these deals, and we have to come up. We think these are very important. That doesn't mean that we just rubber stamp and automatically approve any deal or any proposal. We obviously take a look at them very carefully. But overall, we support free trade, and we think that passing these deals is a good thing for the industry. So really quickly, what can you do? How can your company become more active in following and addressing some of these international trade issues? Well, the first one is just doing a better job of monitoring. And how can you do that? Well, reading our publications, looking out for some of these acronyms that I've talked about. We have a Talking Trade newsletter that goes out once a month. It's kind of like CAP Report, but focused exclusively on international trade issues. Ensuring leadership and responsibility. I'm shocked by how many members I talk to, and I ask them, who in your company, who on your staff, who on your executive team is following these issues and thinking about, what do we think about this? What are our objectives? If this deal passes, how is it going to impact our business? Is it going to mean increased competition, increased opportunities, new market opportunities? What does it mean? A lot of people aren't thinking about this stuff, and they should be. Participating actively in formal consultations. I mentioned that the key to effective U.S. trade policy is that participation from the industry, different industry representatives. And so you can do that through the association. You can let us know, and we can communicate on behalf of the industry, or you can do that as an individual company. But it's important that if there's something going on that is important to you and it's going to impact your business, you let us know so we can communicate and try to get the right outcomes to you. And then obviously, and this is not specific to trade, this is for all of the issues that you cover with our government affairs team, it's important to build relationships, It's important to be in there on a routine basis and educate these people about your business. And then from a trade perspective, why is international trade important to you? Are you sourcing from abroad? Are you exporting? Are you manufacturing abroad? Making sure that they understand your international trade story and think about how these different things that come across their desk are going to impact you, the constituent, their members, the people that they need to look out for and protect. So that is it from an international trade perspective. I hope that I've given you some context to make a little bit more sense of some of these things that you've seen in the paper or on the news, and I hope that I've given you some ammunition to go back to your teams internally and say, hey guys, we have to think about this a little bit more and work a little bit more closely with our association to make sure that international trade issues are adequately covered from an industry perspective. So thanks a lot for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Andre. It's great information. We do have a couple questions. I know we're coming up on the hour mark, so I want to keep this fairly brief. One question, the first one is, I would like to know more about how, this is a question for Paul, I guess, what my company can do in regards to the potential new insurance and exempt employee laws that will have a negative effect on my company. So in relating to, you know, healthcare and what role they can play in that whole debate. Paul, hold on one second.
David?
Yep, I can hear you now.
Okay. So can you clarify what you mean by exempt employees? I didn't quite follow that.
Sure. So let's see. What the company can do in regards to the potential new insurance and exempt employee laws. So both, I guess, in terms of labor as well as healthcare. I mean, what can the company be doing to be proactive on these issues?
Well, the first thing to do is to certainly get involved in communicating with your congressman and your senator, and we can help you find out who that is very quickly. So if you have any trouble finding out who that is, please let us know. You have to let them know specifically about different issues that are affecting your business on the healthcare side. There are probably 2 or 3 bills I can point you to, depending on what size your business is, that would immediately have impact. On the exempt employee side, go to management and have a conversation about this, make sure they're aware of it. We don't think a lot of businesses know yet. And the process would be to submit comments to the Department of Labor, and there's a process online at regulations.gov that makes it very easy to submit, and we are also happy to submit them for you if you want to do that.
Thanks, Paul. And absolutely, I mean, if this is something that you want to be more proactive on, get in contact with me. I can put you in contact with Paul, and we can kind of lead you step by step how best to go about doing that. The next question is there anywhere I can go to see the rules and regs, I guess, for the new salary ruling with the overtime rules? And I think, has that been published yet? Has the final rule been out on that yet, Paul?
Yeah, it's in the Federal Register, but it's probably easier for us to post it, David. So let's you and I get together because I have it, and we can put it right on the website.
And we're going to do a follow-up email with this in the recording next week, so I can send it out in that as well, along with this entire presentation, so you have all the information. I guess last question I'll ask both of you is, you know, Andres, you alluded to this at the end of your presentation, but you know, when these guys are going into their, you know, meetings with congressmen, going to a town hall, hosting the congressman at their facility, quick 10, 15-minute meeting at their office, what would be kind of maybe like a 4 or 5 sentence kind of summary of what you would prefer to them in terms of what's coming up in the next month or so? So during August, you go to meet with their legislator, what would you have them say with regards to the issues that you discussed? I know you guys cover a bunch of issues, but try to kind of narrow it down in terms of a quick few bullet points. So Paul, do you want to go first?
Sure. You know, without Sheila on the call, I'd have to say that the transportation bill is certainly important, a long-term bill instead of the 3-month patch that they just passed today, as a matter of fact. So that's primarily one issue. The other thing is the PACE Act that I mentioned. PACE is the one that talks about the small group expansion. That is not controversial, anywhere near as controversial as any of the other healthcare fixes. So that would be a significant help if that gets mentioned at any congressional meeting.
Yep. And if you schedule a meeting and you let me know about it, we can get you all the talking points and information you need to discuss these issues comfortably and more in depth. What do you think, Andres?
Sure. So what I would do on the trade side is just I would fill in this sentence. International trade is important to my company because, okay? International trade policy and these deals that are going on, they can be very complicated. You don't need to be an expert. You don't even need to know all the acronyms. But what you should tell them is why international trade is important to your company. They'll be familiar with all of the different things that are going on. If you're going to, if you're going to say one thing about trade, just think about before you go in the meeting, why is international trade important to your company? What is your company doing? Is it manufacturing abroad? Is it importing? Is it exporting? And let them know about that. The other point that I wanted to make is that, typically before you go in and meet with a representative, you'll go in, you'll do a little bit of research, and you'll look at what some of their positions have been on issues in the past. And sometimes you just assume that you shouldn't raise that issue because they've taken a stance on that issue that's sort of opposite or in contrast to what you want to advocate. And you say, oh, they're against this. I'm not going to. They voted against TPA. They're not pro-trade. I'm not going to even bring that up. But that's not always the case. We just recently had a meeting with a congressman who had voted against TPA and who was the staff person was pleading with us to please help me find companies in my district who want to tell their story about trade and why it's so important, because there's a lot of misinformation that gets out there when it comes to these free trade deals. That, they're going to ship all your jobs abroad, or there's going to be a flood of all these foreign imports, and it's going to put everybody out of business. It's just not factual. And so a lot of times, don't assume that because your congressperson has taken a position on something that they don't want to hear your story. It could be your story that changes their mind. And as we hear during debates and things like that, people change their mind on issues fairly often. It's not uncommon. But in order to do so, they have to hear from their constituents so that they can have justification for taking a position on something. So that happens in trade a lot, especially on the Republican side. There were a bunch of Republicans who voted no on TPA who privately will tell you that they wanted to vote yes, but there was so much information in their districts that politically they just couldn't vote yes. So something else to keep in mind.
Yep, definitely good points. All right, thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you to our panelists, Paul and Andres. Great information from you both. Like I said, I'll be sending out the recording with a follow-up email next week, along with the full presentation for you to refer back to. In terms of our next meeting, I'm looking at some point maybe in September for doing one on, we'll probably bring back Amy and Adam from Aristotle, and we'll talk about kind of peer-to-peer recruitment and mobilization. So both when it comes to recruiting for this program, talking to your colleagues, but then also if we have a big issue come up, we're going to want you talking to your colleagues how to take action on that specific issue as an advocacy leader. So with that, I will end things, and hopefully you all have a great rest of your summer, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks.